so that they know on pause so that we're recording. So welcome to everyone. I am Claire Rason. I'm the co-host on Lawyers Coach, and I am also the founder of Client Talk. Today's webinar celebrates the end of series 3 of Lawyers Coach, and each series of our podcast has a theme, and the theme that ran through series 3 was Law 2.0 and the legal profession in 2021. And not only when you sign up to be a guest on our podcast do you get to chat to us on the podcast, but you also get to join us again for the end of series webinar. So we're really delighted to welcome back some of our speakers and give everyone the opportunity to be able to speak to them. So without further ado, I'm going to first of all invite Ben just to say hello and give us a brief intro.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to this, and hello everyone. So just by way of brief intro, my name's Ben. I'm the founder of a legal media startup called Crafty Counsel. We also run a very active community for people in legal, mainly but not exclusively in-house counsel, and that's what I'm going to be telling you a little bit more about in a bit. I was a lawyer. I started my career at Clifford Chance, and then I became an in-house counsel for a tech company, and that's me.
Fantastic. Look forward to chatting to you in a second, Ben. So next we've got Manu.
Hi guys, yeah, thanks for the invite. So my name is Manu. I'm an ex-general counsel and now run a legal consultancy called Lex Solutions. We specialize in day-to-day support, innovation support, and culture. So helping teams with those aspects.
Fantastic. Alice?
Hi, thanks Claire. So my name's Alice Stevenson. I'm the founder and the CEO of Stevenson Law, a law firm that was set up in 2017, and now there's 24 of us, I think. We specialise in working with fast growth entrepreneurial tech businesses mostly, and predominantly through delivering legal services via subscription.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Sadie.
Hi everybody, I'm Sadie Barron. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Reed Smith. I don't think I probably need to say too much more than that because I'm not a lawyer, never have been. So I guess I feel like I'm the odd one out this morning.
Oh,
but
that's good.
The
good odd one out.
The good odd one out.
And actually, I said last but not least, I've forgotten the most important person, who is my co-host, Ollie.
I was going to say, I've just unmuted myself because I wanted to have a chance to introduce myself. I'm happy for you to do most of the talking, Claire, but I'm Oliver Hansard. I do the podcast with Claire, love working with Claire, and I have my own coaching business, Hansard Coaching, and really looking forward to the morning.
Fantastic. So just a kind of a brief introduction before we turn over to the panel, and morning to everyone who's saying hello in the chat as well. When Ollie and I were planning series 3, we reflected back on the first 2 series, and the theme for this first series was empathy. We recorded the first series over the first lockdown, and we spoke to managing partners, we spoke to private practice, and also some GCs. And there was a real sense that empathy was needed, not just for the way that managing partners needed to deal with their employees, the relationship between private practice and in-house, but just across the board, there was a real sense that empathy was needed. The second series, again, reflected the moment in time, I think, when we recorded it. And the theme that came out was really success. And there was a real reflection around what that meant. There was a lot of discussion around whether perhaps that notion of success was something that was driving the unhappiness that some people were feeling in the profession. And I think it was probably a point in time where people were reflecting on what was fulfilling in their lives and where they wanted to go with the future. So when we turned to series 3, we both agreed it would be interesting to think about the impact of 2020 and the pandemic on the legal profession. Would themes like empathy be carried forward? Ollie and I are both former lawyers, and we're both also coaches, so we hoped that empathy would be something that would carry forward. But there were also a number of other trends that we were seeing, and we were interested to see, what would be a kind of a snapshot moment in time and what would carry forward. So what were some of those themes? Now, working from home is an obvious one, and that's something. I just lost my view of Zoom. Let me get that back again so I can see people. So working from home was one that was kind of an obvious one and was forced upon people, but that's something that's going to throw up some really interesting challenges this year as we start to get back into the workforce. And actually empathy is going to be really important there. And interestingly, I read an article from the Harvard Business Review this week or last week around how actually the fact that we're all working from home is starting to impact on the trust in teams. And whereas there was lots of trust at the beginning of 2020, that trust is starting to fall away. So that's going to be an interesting theme for 2020. Working from home has also reinforced this idea that your team could be anywhere. Manu, his core team spans across 3 continents and did so before the pandemic. So it'd be interesting to hear some reflections from Manu. Alice is relocated in 2020. So again, be interesting to hear from her. And Sadie, when we spoke on the podcast, talking about how actually the world is now your oyster in terms of recruitment. So that will be an interesting theme to reflect on. There's also been some legal trends this year. So legal design has been something that we've spoken about a lot this year. And I think, again, possibly turning back to that idea of empathy being kind of quite central to the idea of design thinking. Contract optimization, another thing that's kind of coming up this year or 2020, and again, perhaps pushed by remote working. But we've called this webinar the human touch, because I think this idea of humanizing the law is something that has really been powerful in 2020. And we've had the rise of the O-shaped lawyer. I don't know if there are any O-shaped lawyers among us today, but that's been something that's been really powerful, culminating in the EasyJet virtual Himalayas pitch, which if you haven't seen it, Google it, because, finally a pitch that I think those of us in marketing and BD would finally want to get involved in, because it just looked brilliant. We've had the Mindful Business Charter. We've had a real focus on diversity and the need to make people feel like they belong. So humanizing the law is something that we're going to be talking about today. And there's a real sense of a need for authenticity, which is being played out on social media, but even in the shift, and, we can see it in the speakers today, the shift from, having to have that green screen behind us on Zoom calls or when we're doing this sort of event, to actually now just having the real life behind us, albeit I've still got the mess over here hidden from view, but a real sense of a need for authenticity. So we're going to be exploring all of that today. Ben has to leave us early, so he's going to be up first. And if you've got any questions for Ben, therefore, please do ask them at the end of his discussion with me. But if you've got questions, comments, thoughts, please do pop them in the chat, because either Ollie or I, when we're not talking, will be monitoring and picking those up. And before we start, and before I get over to Ben, I'd just be really interested to have a think from the audience as to what themes you've been seeing, or if there are any themes that I've been talking about that have really resonated with you, because again, we can pick those up as we're going through this morning. So any themes that have really resonated with you? Or if you want to take yourself off mute and just throw some thoughts about themes that have resonated. Okay, well, I'll leave that on in the background, but please do comment and we'll be picking those up, and maybe we'll have a look at some of those themes that have resonated with you when we finish off with Ben. So I want to start with Ben now, and thank him again for joining us. And Ben, one of the themes that you mentioned in the podcast, and one that I've not yet mentioned in the intro, was this shift from in-house lawyers, which is obviously a huge part of your community, who have really shifted in 2020 from risk managers to business partners. So I wonder if you can just explain a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. And so to, I guess, put a bit of context on why I have a view on this. So I was an in-house lawyer, but that's just one person's opinion. We've been, since the pandemic hit really, at Crafty Counsel, we've put a big emphasis on community, and we've been running, we now do between 8 and 10 Zoom meetups for different bits of legal, mainly but not exclusively in-house counsel, 8 to 10 a month. and we have more than 200 people attending these meetups now, and a few people I recognize on the call. So that's sort of given us an interesting perspective on what people are worrying about, particularly in the in-house world. And although to some extent, what I'm going to share is sort of unapologetically kind of anecdotage, it's also anecdotage with a sort of big body of people, and you really see some trends coming through. So on this theme of the shift from GC or in-house lawyer from sort of risk manager to business partner, I see a few trends coming through. Just firstly, comment on the topic. Becoming a business partner, it's the topic that keeps on giving. So we talk about it a lot. Unlike, say, how to implement a contract management system, you're not going to be done, right? So we're going to still be talking about how can lawyers be more empathetic, as you picked up earlier, Claire, how we can work closer with the business, how we can partner. We're going to be talking about that next year. We're going to be talking about it in many years to come, but it's still an important topic. And I think particularly in the pandemic, as many of us move to working remotely, I think there's been even more emphasis on that and even more concern about getting that right. So when I sort of try to pull out some of the trends that we've seen, I think it's sort of cluster into two groups. There's, and apologies for terminology, but there's sort of like the hard stuff and the soft stuff. So, and when I say soft stuff, that's more on the sort of the cultural piece, the empathetic piece, the O-shaped lawyer type qualities. And to call that soft, it's not to say it's less important, but let's go with that terminology. So if on that category of the soft side, I think there's a few trends I've seen coming through in what in-house lawyers have been saying to us in our community. One is transparency. So can in-house lawyers do more to offer their business colleagues insight into what they're doing? So I know one legal team, for example, who try and do that by regularly getting their colleagues in the C-suite or other sort of senior positions to come to the legal team meetings. So they have a rota, people come in and they see what's going on. So they're lifting the lid on what's happening inside of legal, trying to make that a bit less of a black box. Similarly, the other way around. So sending legal as almost delegates to marketing, sales, ops, other bits of the business to just break down those barriers and make sure that there is that sort of open communication and less of a mystery around what legal's doing. So that's one on transparency. Another team I know, what they try and do there is they run a Kanban board. So like Trello, if any of you have seen that, which sort of says what they're doing, what's yet to start, what's in progress, what's being done. And they use that to measure, they use that to manage the legal projects they're working on. And they share that transparently with the rest of the business in order to show what they're doing. It's a bit less of a mystery. It also helps the conversation around pushing back sometimes on work requests. Finance director coming in saying, it's super urgent, you need to drop everything and do my thing. And then they can share their board and say, that's great, would love to help you. What do you think we should drop out of all these other things that our colleagues are doing? And sometimes that helps just give a little bit of context, and it's not just sending requests into legal. So the transparency bit, and I think some people are doing interesting stuff on that. One GC talked with us recently about using the leverage that you've got. So this person was saying that they attend their company's board meetings. And this person said that he's not afraid to call out the role of legal. And he said to the chair that most things that seem to go wrong in this company seem to go wrong because legal got involved too late. And he was sharing that by way of an example of perhaps sometimes lawyers are a little bit reticent to sort of command the space that we occupy. And he was saying, actually, if you've got that position, or if your GC does, how can you use that to make sure that actually, where you've got that channel into the most senior part of the business, how do you take advantage of that and make sure that legal's voice is being heard? And then the other piece, and perhaps most important, is having really open and frank discussion about what legal's for. Because my experience, myself from being an in-house lawyer, is that it's really easy for legal to end up doing everything. To simplify, if it's kind of complicated and boring, but doesn't have numbers in it, then a lot of people will think that, well, that's a job for the lawyers, right? And then you can end up doing a bit of everything. And I certainly saw that mission creep when I was in-house. We have ran a recent community session where I just asked everyone, of the following areas, does legal take primary responsibility for these? And I mentioned things like insurance, employment contracts, compliance, running your share register and cap table, and various other things. And it's not that there's a right answer. So there isn't one. Every company is different. And the reason for legal being more or less involved in those areas will differ from company to company. But the interesting thing is that everyone had a different approach. And no company was the same. And I think what that flows into is that I think what can be really powerful is where legal does have great alignment with the rest of the business on what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And that gets into that whole question of, you know, more for less, which is another phrase that gets bandied around. So legal, particularly in a growing business, legal can't just expand to keep pace with revenue or the demands in the business. So something's got to give. And yes, there's stuff around efficiency and so on, and that technology, but actually, you know, what are you going to do and what are you not going to do? And sometimes the company can decide that there's particular types of risk that, or particular areas of work that doesn't have to be done by legal. So those are some of the sort of broad strokes on, I guess, what I call that soft side of trends that we've been seeing through the community last year of in-house lawyers who are trying to partner with the business. Partner doesn't, and I guess with some of the examples show that doesn't just mean doing what the business wants you to do, but having that transparency and that sort of relationship of trust where you can have those conversations. Claire, you mentioned the O-shaped lawyer, and I know that's going to come up later in this webinar. But I think, you know, those trends all do speak to those sorts of qualities of having empathy, having strong communication skills, and building those relationships of trust. That's a bit on the soft side. Just very briefly then on what I call the hard side. So what are some of the things that we've been hearing about that in-house lawyers have been doing in terms of technology or process to build up that sort of partnering type relationship? Few things very briefly. Self-serve, I think, continues to be a big trend. So meaning, can the legal team find a way, empowered through often quite light touch use of technology, to enable the business to do more? So providing templates. A lot of teams are making good use of intake forms. So either, you know, at the ambitious end, anything that you want legal to do, you have to fill out a form, and then that gets pulled into the legal team's matter management spreadsheet on the back end, and you run the whole thing that way. Some teams do that. Others maybe just focus on a particular use case, NDAs, sales agreements, things, repetitive requests. Instead of emailing legal and getting into a battle of emails around always the same questions, you know, which legal entity is it? How long is the term? Is there a parent company guarantee? All the usual stuff, having it all in a form. So some teams are making good use of that. And the nice thing about that is often you can be using tech the company has already. So if you're on Google, using Google Forms, if you're on Microsoft, using Microsoft Forms. It can be a controversial topic, because I've talked about some in-house lawyers who said, I don't want to put a form in between me and the business, which goes back to the question of what's your culture? How do you want to be perceived? How do you want to work with the business? So it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I guess a step up from that is then some teams going even more ambitious with effectively what they call a sort of front door for legal. And this has been a trend for a few years. And some, usually sort of larger in-house teams, have quite sophisticated sort of portals for contacting legal and putting everything through, you know, a common workflow. But as I mentioned with the forms, you know, others, you know, just by improvising with some technology that's readily available, you can actually simplify some of your processes. And then I think you mentioned two things already, Claire, which I think are really interesting in terms of shifting that perception to be more of a partner and work in a more collaborative way. One is the design and simplification, and that's a big trend. I think we're going to hear more of that later. How can you make contracts more simple for the end user, easier to understand, work more for the longer term? and another is standardization. And where can we, instead of reinventing the wheel the whole time, can we have more common use of contracts? And many of you will have seen in the last few weeks this movement around one NDA, where Electric Opponents from the Law Boutique has led, but it's very much, I think, a sort of community initiative, a campaign to get everyone using one common NDA. So we don't have to fight about and negotiate NDAs, but also it's not about putting a technology solution on an NDA to review what you receive and see if it conforms with your company standard terms, but actually should the whole industry be moving to something that's more of a common form. So I guess those are some of the examples of maybe sort of some of the more technical things that in-house lawyers have been doing or thinking about to try and shift the dial to be more of a business partner. And I guess I'd leave us with a thought, which is this week had a call with one of our groups talking about when are we going to go out to the office, will we go out to the office, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the lawyers made an interesting comment, which is, he said, look, I feel like I'm becoming a service center. I'm only available remotely. I'm a Slack. I'm someone that you send messages to on Slack, and I can get on Zoom calls. But I feel like we're now just sort of processing stuff that the rest of the business is doing. And it used to be that we'd get pulled into meetings organically. We'd hear stuff, the so-called water cooler moment. But you would hear stuff around the office, and you'd get involved, and people would think of you. That sort of the intangible ways that we work together. So that's that's a challenge. And some of the so-called hard things I mentioned, there's still a gap there, right? You can have all your processes, but there's still this open question as in the new world that many of us are moving to. How do we work together in a sort of more sympathetic way and keep that sort of sense of partnership and not just be, as he put it, the service center.
Thanks, Ben.
Broad strokes.
Lots of parallels there. I know there's lots of marketeers online in terms of the way that marketing teams work with lawyers in private practice, interestingly, particularly around that. I love the idea of that. What on this board do you want me to get rid of so that we can do your thing? I'm sure that's something that Sadie will pick up later. I'm conscious of time, and I know that you need to jump off. So if anyone has got a question for Ben, now is your chance to ask it. But otherwise we will move on to Manu and Ollie. Some comments that have come through whilst you were chatting. One of them from Ollie about HR professionals internally call themselves business partners, whether perhaps that's a shift that legal might want to pick up. I should say Ollie was also in-house, so he's seen it from from both sides as well.
Yeah, and I think lawyers increasingly are happy to call ourselves business partners. We were interviewing someone yesterday who was a GC in Beijing, and she said, the core role of the in-house lawyer is to minimize risk for the company. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but that was interesting. I don't think I've heard that in a while. And I think there are a number of in-house lawyers who would now probably say something different about what the core role is. Perhaps it's taking risk together, like having a clear sense of what we're doing here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that on every given point you're going to minimize risk. There's circumstances where if you're a small company doing a deal with a big company, you're going to take a lot of risk in that contract because of your negotiating position, but it might be worth it. And a good lawyer can guide you to doing that rather than marking up the whole document and saying these points are unacceptable.
But might it be the case, Ben, that it's not about what you're doing in terms of the minimizing of the risk, but it's how you're doing it. So you're doing it in a partnership way, as opposed to just doing it to the business or to an individual. And for me, that business partner is a stylistic thing in many respects, as opposed to just being a kind of more of a harder and functional thing.
it's always about context, right? We're in there to be able to enable the success of the business. And so obviously mitigating success is part of that, but all of it needs to be done in the context of helping the business be successful and achieve its objectives. I actually want to ask Ben a quick question before he goes, because it was interesting what he finished up on, to say that now some lawyers are feeling that they're more service center people and just doing transactional work, whereas during the pandemic, I remember in his podcast he was saying, well, this concept of business partners happened because legals were pulled more into the strategy, so they were asked to actually help fulfill that. So I guess maybe that's at different levels, a GC level and junior level, or maybe it's something that we just need to make sure that we keep that momentum up to make sure that we are still at that table.
It happens that was a GC who was saying that, but
Really?
I think it does vary from company to company, and I think probably also where we are in this journey. So yeah, I mean, the topic of conversation this week was partly how involved is legal in trying to shape the new pattern of working. And that got really interesting responses. Some not really at all, others in a very collaborative way. A couple of lawyers talking about exiting leases, and the legal team have been sort of instrumental in those negotiations. One lawyer said, look, actually they're in an investment firm, and this person said, look, they all want to go back, and we want to go back, but we felt that legal were the ones saying, sorry, it's kind of against the law, or at least the spirit of the law. We can't do it. And actually he said that became quite difficult, and legal were suddenly again being perceived as the blockers, but in this case blockers to getting people being back in the office.
Interesting. Thanks, Ben. As I said, I'm conscious of time, and thank you so much for joining us today. If you can hang around for a bit longer, that's fantastic. Otherwise, so grateful for you for your time, not only on the podcast. For those of you who haven't heard Ben's podcast with us, then do take a listen of that. Yeah, thanks very much. And Manu, you're next up, so a nice segue into the discussion with you.
Yeah, thanks for your time, Ben. Manu, thanks for joining as well. I suppose where I'd love to start is on well-being, and that being a massive theme for 2020 and a big focus as everybody's been working remotely. How can we keep that as a positive theme moving forward into this year, and as we go back into the office? How can we keep well-being high up on the agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. I think that's a great question. I think it's down to all of us to keep that agenda, or keep it high up on the agenda and keep talking about it. So organizations and teams realized during the pandemic that well-being was super important for their employees, because now everybody was remote, and they needed to make sure that they were both healthy and happy and engaged and productive. So it was important to them, but they also realized that the well-being strategies that they put in place needed to be rethought because people were not in the office. So doing yoga or mindfulness in the office where people came together wasn't necessarily going to work, so they needed to be creative. And individuals, as you say, are very mindful that well-being, their personal well-being, is super important, either because during the pandemic they've been able to look after themselves because they've had more time, they haven't been commuting so much, or
they haven't been able to look after themselves.
Oh, well, exactly. The others are the polar opposite of that. They haven't been able to leave the house, they haven't stopped working, they've been managing the kids, and so their well-being actually has suffered. So it is high on the agenda. We need to keep it high on the agenda, and I think it's incumbent on organizations and teams to continue with the creativity that they had during the pandemic, to rethink those the well-being strategies that they might have employed, and think, well, how does that work in the new environment? And we're probably we are moving to a hybrid environment. So how do we do that in that new normal that's about to come? But we need to make sure that we are creative and motivated to be able to do that. The other thing that we need to think about is that well-being, the way that it was traditionally done, or the way that it has been done, isn't the only way. And it's not just about yoga and meditation, although people who know me know I'm a big proponent of those activities and I love them. It's also thinking about how we work with each other, and to the point made earlier about trust and about there need to be trust within the working environment. That's going to be super important as we go to a hybrid environment. And there's a theory within psychology called the self-determination theory, which is super important, especially in relation to the work context. And I'm sure you know about it, Ollie. So it's all about 3 basic human needs that we need to ensure for the well-being of our employees and our teams, and to make sure that they remain motivated. That's autonomy, so that they are able to make their own decisions and they've got control over their own domain. It's competence, so that's the balance between being challenged but also being facilitated to be successful. And then the third part, which is relatedness, so making sure that you're part of a social structure, that you are able to engage with other people, that you feel that other people have got your back and you can look after other people. That's always been important. It became even more important in the pandemic, and it's going to be really, really important to make sure that we continue with that going forwards. And as we think about how we want to work going forwards, I think, you know, these 3 concepts are going to be super, super important.
And do you think there's a risk then that as we go back to the office, we've become used to a certain degree of autonomy in a new form? Is there a risk then that autonomy is taken away and there's friction as a result of that change and that readjustment back to the office?
Yeah, I don't know, it's difficult. I think some people will feel that they have had more autonomy, and in some cultures they'll feel that they've had less. And it's thinking about what is that autonomy. So the concept of trust goes right through all of this. So how much do you trust your peers, your colleagues, especially those that you're not necessarily working with on a day-to-day basis? So now people are working more in cliques of the people that they engage with, and others who they don't necessarily work with on a day-to-day basis, but they might have walked past at the water cooler or otherwise and had some relationship with. So they felt that they were part of a bigger organization or a wider team. So yeah, I think it's going to be important to make sure then also how we work, right? We can't continue to have meeting after meeting after meeting. It's not practical, it's not helpful, it's not productive. So if we're moving into a new environment, which decisions will require a meeting? Which decisions allow us to just work through a Google Doc? And which meetings will be a hybrid? And so we need to think and split the work up in that way. And I think autonomy will be a big part of that.
And are you optimistic that we'll get better at that? We'll get better at deciding when do we really need that meeting? How can we work effectively together and build that relatedness, and better at saying, well, no, that's when I can work autonomously. Are you optimistic about that?
I'm hopeful. I mean, we don't know how it's going to pan out. I mean, whether we actually, you know, build on the momentum that we've had and the creativity, the thinking, the motivation, or whether people just go back to normal. So I know we're going to talk about culture, and culture is super important to all of that. But up until now, it's always been considered as a side issue, as has well-being, as has diversity, right? But we now need to realize that these are all part of the business plan. The business plan includes these things, and diversity and culture and everything else are enablers of that. So am I optimistic? I hope so, because I hope, you know, I just generally am a hopeful person, and I hope that trend will continue. So yeah, and if people like us keep beating the drum on it, and we see the good work that Crafty and Alice and Sadie are doing in this space, then I think that's definitely going to help.
So you think then culture is at last on the lawyer's list on the lawyer's to-do list?
It's never really been high on the agenda. I think people have talked about it and said that we want to have the right culture, but culture only really works when it's intentionally and consciously created. So now we've got the opportunity to be able to rethink how we want it to happen, what the output of that's going to be, and it's not just owned by one individual or even one team. So traditionally it might have been in like an HR function working with the board, and then it's permeated throughout the business. But actually, I mean, there was an HBR article a few weeks, maybe a couple of months ago, basically talking about the fact that everyone owns and has responsibility for the culture within their organization. And I do organization relationship systems coaching, and that's all about making sure that, you know, all the relationships in the system have a voice, and so therefore can work together. And that's where you get true collaboration and true productivity.
And so it's in our gift. It's in the lawyer's gift to evolve the culture in a way that will make them as effective as they possibly can be.
Yeah, I think so. But I think, you know, to the point that we were talking about with Ben as to how much influence we have on the wider organization, I'd like to think that, you know, we do. You know, if we are, you know, if we're GCs and we're at the top table, then we should be able to influence and how the organization works. And culture is obviously part of that. What's the culture of the legal profession more generally, and how does that evolve? Obviously, what's in our gift is how our teams work, and so we can definitely think about the culture that we have within our team and how our team operates. And law firms can do that within their own organizations, but collectively there's a big change that we could facilitate in the legal profession more generally. And Alice is doing a big part of that by standing out there, and her success, you know, even through the pandemic of attracting new clients and new people to that new model, you know, where her values are very transparent and open, is the types of things that we want to be able to see that change. So culture within the legal profession, I think up until now, has been really inflexible. But now the time is right to be able to do something interesting. And we've got the motivation, we've got the creativity, we've got the opportunity to be able to do that. So I'd say, you know, in that context, we should strike while the iron's hot. How do you mold something, you know, which is made of metal? You can only do that when it's hot and malleable. And I'd like to think now the legal profession is in that space where we can introduce some flexibility and mold it the way that we want to going forwards.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you. Anybody got any questions for Manu? We've got a few coming in. Some questions there about comments about self-determination. Yeah, this is interesting how culture is about being intangible, and maybe that's a real challenge for lawyers, is we work intangibles, and how can we get the confidence maybe to mold something that is intangible, but mold it in a way that truly is for our benefit and have that impact. I suppose it's back to your optimism point, Manu, about, you know, if we're aware of it, we can do something about it and actually mold it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, awareness is super important on so many different levels. When we talked, Claire, about you know, the traits that make lawyers, you know, good lawyers, but sadly, you know, in lots of cases unhappy, and the stats within the profession about depression, anxiety, alcoholism, even suicide are super high and really compelling and sad. Now, it's not the only factor, but part of that is the fact that we have got traits that might make us really good lawyers, but they make us sadly unhappy people. And the more that we practice those activities without a counterbalance, so for instance, being pessimistic and skeptical and always thinking about what could go wrong, without a counterbalance to do some more positive activities, and without feeling like we're in a team that's looking after us, then that can lead to you know, depression, and you know, that's really sad. But how can we help that? Is, to your point, it's about awareness. So once you're aware of that, and you're aware of how we can deal with it and how we can make it better, then we've got a good opportunity.
And Manu and I, if you're interested in kind of some of the themes that we're touching on lots of themes today, so we can't go into great depth on any of them, but Manu and I are doing a session next week, which is going to be a workshop around kind of stress and success. So I'll send a link to everyone who's attended today if that's of interest. One of the questions that's popped up is a really nice question, and I'm going to use that as a segue into Alice. So Manu, thank you ever so much. Manu, I don't know, do you need to jump off early, or can you stay with us?
I can stay till the end, yes.
Fantastic. So there'll be a chance to ask Manu some more questions at the end. But the next question that's come up is one around culture, and that there seems to be a prioritization of culture, you know, in perhaps in these smaller startup firms and in larger firms. And Sadie, you'll get a chance to respond to everything that's gone on. I'm sure you've got, I see you scribbling notes, so you'll have a lot to comment on when we get to the end. But I
was going to ask Sadie that question too, so yeah.
So there you go. But Alice, do you think that's true? Do you think that one of the advantages of a firm of your size and one of the reasons behind your success is that you really have focused on that culture, and a culture in an environment where, you know, you work remotely anyway?
I mean, I don't think that size really has a lot to do with it, to be honest. I think, you know, every firm has a culture. It's just, you can have good cultures and you can have bad cultures. I think one of the challenges that law firms face is that you know, they're predominantly led by lawyers, and not enough non-lawyers are allowed a seat at the table. And I think that I don't agree with that. I think that has a negative impact on culture. You know, lawyers aren't often trained in business, trained in culture. You know, my background before I went into law was HR. So I did a degree in HR, I did my postgrad diploma in HR, and I worked in HR. So I've always had a really good understanding of how company culture works and the benefits of it. But lots of lawyers don't have that. So I think, and I think culture is something that is really driven from the top, from the board, from the people who are running the company, and from the values that those people have. And without that being right, then I don't think you can have a positive culture. I think, you know, the HR teams can support that. They can create initiatives to promote the culture that the board wants to promote within the business, but ultimately it's got to be driven from the board. So I can see in the question that, you know, is there a challenge around sort of maintaining a culture as you grow? And I don't think that you can't lose a culture. So your culture is constantly evolving and adapting, and you need to constantly work at it to make sure that that's happening in a positive way. And over the last 12 months, you know, we've all undergone radical changes. We've all had to start working remotely, and that's had a huge impact on our cultures, our ways that we're communicating with each other, our ways of supporting each other. And we've had to adapt to that. And ultimately, that's a cultural transition. And it's exactly the same when a company grows, or, you know, any change that a company goes through is going to have to be managed and dealt with in exactly the same way. And it can be managed well, and it can be managed badly. And ultimately, that depends on the strength of the people in charge of that business.
I am actually going to bring Sadie in now. I'm not stealing Oliver's thunder with the question, because I think it's useful to have the conversation now. And I know, you know, one of the things that Sadie, we spoke about when we were on the podcast was the need, and it's, you know, something we've spoken about many times, you know, in public forums, but also in private, about, you know, you need to get more people at the table. And interesting, Ben's reflections there about getting the in-house lawyer into different parts of the business. And I know that's something that Reed Smith is trying to do, you know, within Reed Smith. So I just what your reflections on this topic as well, whilst we're on it.
Well, I think Alice and I kind of preach from the same choir. From my perspective, I think you have to be very deliberate about your culture, and I completely agree, you've got to work at it all the time. And I've been at a firm where I've watched the culture change because of management, and not in a good way either. And it took a long time, I think, for it to rebuild back up again. So I think, but it also, if I'm going to put on a slightly more negative hat, and apologies for that, I also think it's about how we measure people and how we deal with people and how we live and breathe the values. And still to this day, one of the challenges I find is when you get right down to the wire about how a lawyer is successfully judged, it doesn't necessarily always bring out the right values. Now, I'm really fortunate. I work in a firm where we're a single profit share partnership globally, which is still, I think, relatively unusual, which means that eat what you kill mentality isn't as strong in the firm, and a high emphasis is placed on collaboration, which is one of our values. And so that makes a difference. It really does. But, I do think you have to be very deliberate about it. I do think you have to live it from the top. Our values were determined by our global managing partner 2 years ago. He uses every opportunity to talk about them. It's ultra linked to our brand and the purpose of why we all get up and come to work every day. And that's been a big part of who we are and what we do as well. And I think that does make for a really interesting culture. And I often say to people about Reed Smith, I wish I could bottle it and just get you to kind of smell it, because when you're here, it's super special. And there's a great DNA to the firm, but it's a little intangible, all that stuff. So putting values around it, putting purpose around it, putting brand around it, all that sort of stuff helps with that kind of communication of what we stand for. But it's super, super important.
And I think, perhaps this year, a couple of things have happened. One is that importance of what, kind of what I touched on at the beginning in terms of reflecting on, what are the values of the organisation that I work for? Because I think lockdown has meant that everyone has had that space to reflect on what is important to me, and, what impact does my day-to-day have on the life? This is what I'm giving up. I know as a mum of 4, the fact that I've been at home with the 4 of them hasn't always been a positive, but it's given you the opportunity to say, well, actually I can sit down to dinner with my family, which is something perhaps I haven't done for a long time because I'm going to work. So actually, what does work bring me in, and how aligned are my values with my company's values? And another thing which I'm going to talk to Alice about now is authenticity, because I think that there's been a lot this year of, I say this year, we're now in 2021, it still feels like 2020, but there's a lot of focus in 2020 around authenticity, and social media has been a platform that I think has been used in a way that up to 2020 it never had been. And Alice, that's a big part of your company's values is authenticity. So do you think that that's something that smaller firms are better placed to do, or do you think that it's something that every firm can be authentic? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I don't think you can use authenticity as a descriptor for a company. Personally, I don't know, people might disagree with me. I'm interested to know if they do. I think authenticity applies to a person, and I mean, from my perspective, authenticity is important to me and a value of my company. And through my personal experiences of training as a lawyer, working as a lawyer, something that I really struggled with, feeling that, like you were saying before about how aligned are your values with the values of your employer. I think it's really, really important that you do have as much alignment as possible, because otherwise you're being put under pressure to conform to values that you don't truly believe in. And if that's the case, you can't behave authentically. It's not possible. So I think it is really important to understand what your company's values are and understand what your own values are. I think, lots of people wouldn't actually be able to answer that question if you asked them. It's not something that people tend to sort of stop and think about. But I think it's really, really worthwhile having a little bit of time to yourself to actually think about that and what is important to you. Because if you want to start, being authentic, then I think you have to understand that you have to have a really good knowledge of what makes you tick and what's important to you. And then once you do have that understanding, and if you're in an environment that allows you to, then you can start behaving a lot more authentically. And the result of that is you actually end up building greater trust with people that you work with, your clients, your team. And you also have a greater sense of satisfaction with your work. More generally, the evidence shows that you'll experience less stress, less anxiety, less depression, because you're not putting up this mask, this facade of conformity, which I've talked about before. So there's lots and lots of benefits to doing it from both an employee's perspective and an employer's perspective. An employer is not going to be doing as well as it could be doing if it's forcing all of its employees to conform to values that those employees don't believe in, because ultimately those employees are not going to stick around. And if they do stick around, they're going to be pretty toxic for that company. So I think anybody can do this. This is not exclusive to people like me who run my own business. It's absolutely something that everybody can do, but I think it's something that you have to do consciously and deliberately, and really, make that decision that this is something that you're going to do.
And I think, that's it for those of you online that are interested on this topic. Plugging one of the previous podcasts that we did with Eloise Skinner, we spoke a lot about values, and Ollie, me, Manu do a lot of work around kind of values-based coaching, and it is really important, and as you say, a conscious decision. And I'm going to bring Sadie in, and then again, Alice, thank you. We'll pick up with some Q&A at the end, but kind of a final question for me to segue into you. I mean, this idea of authenticity and social media is a really interesting one, because you want your lawyers to engage in social media. It helps them build their personal brand. That helps build Reed Smith's brand. But then you all have social media policies in place of what people can and can't say. There will be fear, particularly below partner level, I imagine, of, well, I can't possibly say that because someone might take that the wrong way, perhaps. So how do you deal with that in a bigger organization? How do you encourage people to be their authentic selves when you're trying to deal with so many people, and where something that someone says as a partner at Reed Smith could quite quickly go viral and put you in a whole world of trouble?
And it has. We're very simple. We have one rule, which is don't write something you wouldn't like your mum to read. And that's it. That's basically our policy on social media. We do want to encourage authenticity. I am 100% with Alice on this, and I take a very personal view on it. I know when I'm trying to be something I'm not, I fail miserably. And so I have to bring my most authentic self to work every day. And I suffer for a little bit from imposter syndrome. I'll put my hands up to that one. And there are days when I think, deep breath, got to do it. So from that perspective, I think we try and encourage authenticity, particularly on social media as well. We try and encourage the idea of not broadcast, but dialogue. It's okay to have a comment. It's okay to have an opinion. We do have some guidance around not commenting on clients. We try and steer away from very direct comment on clients. So that is kind of don't write something that your mum wouldn't want to see. And we've had a few instances of that. And don't talk about clients unnecessarily unless you have permission to do so. And we try and keep it that simple. And then we allow them to be who they are. Because one of the things that we discovered through our brand project, which was a long time ago now, 4 years ago, but I stand by it, is one of the things that came through really clearly on the research we did with our staff and our clients and our peer firms, was people like doing business with Reed Smith lawyers because they're straightforward and straight talking and very authentic. They like the people on the other side of the table. So we ran with that. We were like, okay, well, we kind of got permission to say, we want you to be your very best self every day, but we don't want you to be something different. We don't want you to be little clones. That's not who we are. That's not what makes this amazing smelling Reed Smith DNA thing that I'd love to bottle and I can't. So I don't know if that helps, Claire, but I think try not to have too many rules around social media. Otherwise you just lock people into something that's not very authentic and very corporate.
And a lovely comment there from Jeremy around how social media is a great I can't put my teeth in, great window into the culture of an organisation. Seeing how individual lawyers behave versus firm accounts is always an eye-opener. And I think that is definitely definitely true. I'm going to pass over to Ollie now for the questions, but again, what time?
No, I was just going to make a comment actually. To me, it's back to risk, right? It's a balance of risk, and maybe what you've done, Sadie, is say, well, what's a bigger risk, that somebody might say the wrong thing occasionally versus in the round we get a reputation for being a human and great law firm to work for. And for me, you know, people are grown-ups and generally sensible, will have mad moments, but surely that balance of risk is you were better off taking it and letting people be themselves and let us get known as an authentic firm. That sounds like the work that you've done.
Yeah, I think that's really true, you know, and not to be too frightened of the scurrilous, sensational platforms that are out there, you know, because at the end of the day, it does get forgotten eventually. And actually what I'm much more interested, as you say, is building this idea that, you know, you can get a feel for who Reed Smith is based on all of our communication channels, be that, you know, video or podcast or social, or, you know, the website's always a really tough one because that's just a broadcast tool. So don't judge me on my website, please, because it's not that good. It's something I've got to work on still.
Has anyone got any questions? Open it up to the floor. People can either take themselves on mute. I know some of you have got your cameras on already. If people want to ask a question but without their camera on, that's fine. Whatever you feel comfortable with for whichever panelist you want to ask a question of. Or panelists, if you've got questions of other panelists. And one question that I've got, and I don't really know who it's for, it might be for some of the people that we've got in the audience who are GCs, because again, another thing that I've seen this year is a real sense of, you know, GCs realizing that their voice is important to drive change. So obviously around diversity, there's been, you know, lots of companies that have come out and realize that they can make demands of their law firms, and law firms are responding. But I wanted to pick up perhaps one area where, you know, the Mindful Business Charter has tried to do it to an extent, but where, you know, I think in-house counsel are starting to recognize, well, if we want lawyers who aren't stressed, who aren't depressed, who aren't working all of these hours, actually we need to change our behavior too. And if we ask, you know, Reed Smith at 9 o'clock on a Friday to produce us something for, you know, 9 o'clock on Monday morning, you know, that is going to really challenge the well-being of those lawyers. You know, are you seeing that, Sadie, for in-house lawyers online? You know, is that something that you're recognizing that you need to change behaviors with respects to that?
Oh, look, I'm not going to lie. That's probably one of the most challenging things to try and negotiate realistic timeframes for deliveries. And I think the culture still of most law firms is, yeah, we'll jump on it and we'll work all weekend or we'll work through the night. And I've always had a view, literally in the 20-something years I've been doing this, that I've never quite understood why a client would want a tired, stressed out lawyer looking at their contract overnight to get something done. Surely it would be better that they were rested and came in the next morning and, you know, perhaps had a fresh pair of eyes on it. So that kind of 90s, 2000s, you know, working through the night culture stuff, didn't that make us look great? I never understood that. So, but do we jump on stuff? And look, just for 1 second, I'll put it into my context of marketing. You know, do I have to jump on things? Was I working on a pitch last night at 10 o'clock? Yes, I was. And that's about service delivery. And that was a deadline that we were up against, and we were lacking some responses. And it meant that we had to pull a bit of a late one in the team to get that one done. I think it is about negotiation. I think, you know, if you've got a great relationship, if you've got that trusted relationship with a client, then the client is most likely to be able, you know, you can give them a realistic time. Do you mind if I do this on Monday? Do you mind if I, you know, do it on Thursday and all the rest of it? I also think, and forgive me for the clients that are on here, mate, because maybe I'm a little out of touch on this, but there used to be a bit of a sales tactic at my former firm where they would very deliberately ring general counsel on a kind of Friday afternoon, because it was a great way of the general counsel getting rid of stuff off their desks on a Friday. It was a problem that's been sat there all week. And I promise you, it brought in significant amounts of work, that tactic, for a while. So I do think, again, you know, I think it's got to be a partnership here. It's a bit like to what Ben was talking about right at the beginning. You know, how do we make sure that we've got trusted relationships, a great dialogue? You know, things do go wrong. You do have to work late. You do have to put the pressure on at times. But if you don't do it all the time, then you know that it's a genuine request. The problem I have is that it's so hard to weed out what's genuine deadlines and what's not. And that's from my perspective, not actually legal. So And I'm really sorry, but I do actually have to jump to something else.
No,
So
that's
my
okay.
sincere apologies. It has been a real pleasure to share a
Thanks,
panel with.
Sadie, as always, and thanks to everyone. I will stick online. I'm sure Ollie will as well. For those of you who stick around, if you've got questions, do that. But otherwise, thank you all for joining, and particularly thank you to the panel for your time this morning.
No, it's been great. Thanks very much,
Claire.
everyone.
I've got to shoot off as well, but
Yeah,
thank
no
you.
worries. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Alice.
Alice. I know Manu,
Thanks,
you
Claire.
can
Thanks,
Thank
Manu.
you.
Thanks.